Fabian Beard believed in the power of a good script. He believed it could soothe, deflect, and most importantly, control. Seated in the quiet hum of a nondescript rental car, the engine a low thrum against the evening's chill, he would adjust his headset. The small microphone, curved perfectly toward his mouth, an instrument of precision, just like the tools of his trade. Before every assignment he made a call. This was his ritual, his armor. The voice he used was not his own, not really. It was a carefully constructed persona, a blend of practiced empathy and professional warmth. It was the voice of Tom from Westline Utilities, or Mark from Sterling Bank Services. It was a voice that promised resolution, a voice people trusted, even when it delivered a warning they refused to hear. This ritual was more than just a psychological buffer. It was a pillar of his personal code. Fabian called it informed consent. He saw it as a strange, twisted form of mercy. He was offering a choice, a sliver of an opportunity to escape the inevitable. He would deliver a carefully veiled warning disguised as a meter audit, a system update, or a customer satisfaction survey. A detail would be planted, something only the target would understand, a small, verifiable truth to signal the authenticity of the threat. "We've noticed some unusual activity on your account," he might say, or "we'll have a crew in your area tomorrow, so it's best to avoid the East Access Road." He offered them a path out, a head start. It was a courtesy. Of course, they never took it. They would scoff, or bluster, or threaten to call his supervisor. Denial was a powerful human instinct, one Fabian counted on. Their disbelief was not his responsibility. He had done his part. He had extended a hand, however disingenuously. The call was a performance, and the script was his shield against the messy reality of his work. It allowed him to transform a brutal act of violence into a clean, procedural transaction. He was not a killer in those moments. He was a customer service agent closing a ticket. The formal politeness created a sterile distance, a necessary fiction that kept the darkness at bay. The smile he wore while speaking was a crucial part of the act. He had learned long ago that a genuine smile could travel through copper wires and digital signals, warming the tone just enough to be disarming. "Thank you for your patience," he would say, his voice a smooth balm, even as he watched the lights in the target's window. "This won't take long." The phrase was a promise, one he always kept. The courtesy of the call was followed by the efficiency of the job. It was a clean, two-step process. First, the warning. Then, the resolution. This structure was everything. It was the scaffolding that held his fractured morality together, allowing him to function with meticulous, chilling calm. Every aspect of Fabian's professional life was governed by a system. He was a creature of habit and precision, and these weren't just personal preferences. They were survival mechanisms. The world of contract killing was chaotic, bloody, and emotionally corrosive. To navigate it, Fabian had built a fortress of procedure. His handler, Marta, reinforced this world with her own language of corporate efficiency.
Service level agreements, first call resolution, customer churn. These are the terms we live by. We don't just close cases, we resolve them.
Their operation was less a criminal enterprise and more a boutique call center, one that specialized in permanently resolving client issues. This framework was the anesthesia that numbed the grim nature of their business. Fabian's car was his mobile office, a sterile pod that moved through the city's arteries but never truly connected with them. Inside, everything had its place. The burner phones were neatly labeled. The files for each target were organized with the fastidiousness of an accountant. He logged his hours, his mileage, his expenses. After a job was completed, he would sit in the quiet aftermath, the scent of cordite, or the metallic tang of blood still faint in the air, and type up a brief report. He would close the digital file, marking the task with a single clean word, resolved. This final act was a small but vital ceremony, the closing of a ledger, the restoration of a strange kind of order. Even the silence was mandated. Between the courtesy call and the final action, there was often a period of waiting. This was the most dangerous time, when the quiet could allow unwelcome thoughts to seep in. To fill that void, Fabian used hold music. He had a curated playlist of bland looping melodies, the kind you'd hear when waiting for a representative from your insurance company. He timed his movements to the 32-bar loops, the repetitive soothing tunes serving as a metronome for his deadly work. The music was a sonic wall, keeping the messy, unpredictable sounds of the real world out, and his focus razor sharp. It was another layer of the script, a soundtrack for his detachment. This obsession with control extended beyond the job itself. Fabian lived a life of deliberate anonymity. His apartment was Spartan, his personal connections non-existent. He was a ghost who paid his bills on time. He understood that attachments were liabilities, that personal history was a vulnerability. His scripts and procedures were a way of erasing himself, of becoming nothing more than a function, a voice on the phone, a shadow in the night. He had convinced himself that if he followed the rules, if he kept the performance flawless, he could remain untouched by the moral stain of his profession. He was not a monster. He was a highly effective problem solver, a technician of finality. The target for the evening was a mid-level accountant named Alistair Finch, a man who had made the fatal mistake of embezzling from the wrong people. Fabian had the file open on the laptop beside him. He had Finch's schedule, his habits, his fears. The script was ready. He would pose as an agent from the man's home security company, calling about a system glitch that required a manual reset. The planted detail would be a mention of the faulty sensor on the back patio door, a fact Finch would know was true. The escape route offered would be a suggestion to stay at a hotel for the night while the system was patched remotely. It was clean, simple, and elegant. Fabian took a slow, centering breath and dialed the number. He listened to the electronic chirp of the ringing tone, once, twice. On the third ring, a voice answered, but it wasn't the clipped, impatient tone he expected from a man like Finch. This voice was softer, older, and carried a gentle, wandering cadence during...
Hello?
Fabian paused, his internal script momentarily short-circuiting. He checked the number on his screen. It was correct. Perhaps Finch had a father or an uncle living with him. An unlisted variable, an inconvenience. Fabian's customer service voice locked into place automatically. Good evening, am I speaking with Mr. Finch? My name is Tom, and I'm calling from...
Oh no, dear, no Finch here. Haven't been a Finch in this house since the war. The second one, that is. You must have the wrong number.
The man's tone wasn't annoyed or dismissive. It was welcoming, almost pleased to have a caller. Fabian's protocol was clear. Disconnect immediately, verify the number, and recalibrate. A misdial was a breach of process. an unacceptable error, but he didn't hang up. Something in the man's voice held him there. I do apologize for the disturbance. The scripted phrase felt hollow for the first time.
No, it's no trouble at all. It's lovely to hear a human voice. Most of the calls I get these days are those dreadful machines. They don't even have the decency to sound sorry when they're trying to sell you something you don't need.
Fabian felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. A crack in the polished veneer of his detachment. He was supposed to be in control, but this gentle, talkative old man had somehow seized it. Fabian listened for another minute. A minute that stretched into 5. The man who introduced himself as Harold Levin spoke of his late wife, the rising cost of postage stamps, and a time he worked at a complaints desk for the local utility company.
You learn a lot about people when you listen to their troubles all day. Mostly you learn that being polite isn't the same as being kind. Politeness is a shield. Kindness is a bridge.
The words landed with an unnerving precision, echoing the very philosophy Fabian had built his life around. He was a master of politeness, a wielder of shields. The concept of a bridge felt foreign, dangerous. Finally, Fabian found an opening. Well, Harold, it was a pleasure speaking with you, but I really must be going.
Of course. Thank you for calling, Tom. It's not often you get to speak with someone who sounds like they're actually listening.
Fabian was about to disconnect, his finger hovering over the button, when Harold added one more thing. It was a simple, unguarded question, the kind of thing people say without thinking, but it struck Fabian with the force of a physical blow.
And how are you, dear?
The line went quiet. Fabian didn't answer. He couldn't. No one ever asked him that question. His existence was transactional. He was a service provider, a voice, a function. He was not a person to be asked about his well-being. The question hung in the air, a piece of shrapnel, lodging itself deep inside the armor he had so carefully constructed. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he mumbled a platitude and ended the call. He sat in the darkness of his car, the engines idle, the only sound. The face of Alistair Finch, his intended target, felt distant and unimportant. The only thing that felt real was the echo of that gentle, piercing question. Later that night, the job was completed. Alistair Finch became another resolved case file. Another name moved to a closed ledger. The work was as clean and precise as always. Fabian went through the motions following his procedure to the letter. He wiped down his tools, deleted the call log, and drove back to his anonymous apartment. But the usual sense of sterile completion, of order restored, was absent. The silence in the car was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the lingering warmth of an old man's voice, and the haunting weight of a question he had no idea how to answer. The hold music in his head had stopped. Fabian corrected the error. He found the correct number for Alistair Finch and initiated the protocol again. The call went exactly as planned. Finch was arrogant, dismissive, and utterly convinced of his own security. He laughed at the suggestion of a system glitch and threatened to report Fabian, or Tom rather, for incompetence. The denial was textbook, a perfect specimen for Fabian's collection of human folly. It should have been satisfying. It should have reaffirmed the cold logic of his world, where warnings were given but never heeded. The job was a simple matter of procedure from there. A clean entry, a silent resolution. Finch was filed away before midnight, another ticket closed, but the neatness of the act felt wrong. The usual sense of detached accomplishment was missing, replaced by a low, persistent hum of unease. Back in his sterile apartment, Fabian found himself pacing. The silence, normally a welcome companion, fell hollow and accusatory. He tried to focus on his post-job ritual, cleaning his equipment, updating his encrypted ledger, but his mind kept drifting. He kept hearing the gentle, crackling voice of the old man from the misdialed call. Harold Levin. The name had stuck, an unwelcome piece of data in his otherwise clean mental cache. The conversation had been a deviation, a procedural anomaly that should have been immediately purged. He told himself it was the error that bothered him. A misdial was a sign of sloppiness, a crack in his perfect system. Precision was his creed, and he had failed. That had to be it. The man himself was irrelevant, a random variable in a miscalculation. Yet the explanation felt thin. It wasn't the mistake that haunted him, it was the conversation that followed. It was the warmth in Harold's voice, the rambling stories that felt more real than any of the scripted interactions Fabian had all day. It was the man's simple, unforced humanity, a quality Fabian had worked so hard to excise from his own life and work. He found himself standing before his rack of burner phones, each one labelled for a different purpose, a different persona. He had a rule: never revisit a compromised number, never cross the streams. But a powerful, illogical compulsion was rising within him. He needed to hear that voice again. He needed to understand why it had unsettled him so deeply. He could frame it as a follow-up, a quality assurance call to ensure the previous agent had logged the wrong number correctly. The justification was flimsy, a pathetic excuse that went against every rule of his trade. But the pull was undeniable. He picked up a fresh phone, his hand steady, despite the tremor in his resolve. Fabian dialed the number with a sense of trepidation, like an explorer stepping off a map. The phone on the other end rang 3 times, each ring echoing the call from the night before. He braced himself for the possibility that Harold wouldn't answer, or that someone else would. A part of him hoped for it. It would release him from this strange compulsion. But then the line clicked, and the same gentle voice filled his ear.
Hello?
Harold said, a note of pleasant curiosity in his tone. He sounded as if he had been waiting for a call from anyone about anything. The loneliness in that single word was a palpable thing. Good evening, Mr. Levin, Fabian began, his voice sliding into the smooth, reassuring cadence of Mark from Sterling Bank Services. He explained he was calling as part of a quality assurance check regarding a potential misdial to his number the previous evening. We want to ensure our records are accurate, and that our agents are not disturbing citizens unnecessarily. It was a perfect corporate script, airtight and impersonal. He expected Harold to offer a simple confirmation, allowing Fabian to tick a mental box and end the call. His curiosity satisfied.
Oh, that young man. Tom. He was no disturbance at all, a very polite fellow. He sounded like he was in a bit of a hurry. People are always in a hurry these days. My wife, Sarah, she used to say that rushing was just a way of running from yourself. You can't outrun your own feet, she'd say.
Fabian listened, his own script forgotten. He was no longer Mark from Sterling Bank. He was just a man on a phone, listening to a widower talk about his late wife. Harold spoke of Sarah's patience, the way she could sit for an hour watching a bird build its nest, the small rituals they shared that had formed the bedrock of their life together. Fabian stood motionless in his apartment, the city lights glittering coldly outside his window. He was a ghost in his own life, a collection of procedures and false names. Harold, on the other hand, was overflowing with life, even if much of it was in the past. He was a living archive of memories, of love and loss, of small moments that had accrued meaning over decades. Fabian's life was a series of deletions. Harold's was a long, rambling story. The contrast was stark and unsettling. Fabian had called to reassert control, to file the anomaly away. Instead, he found himself being drawn deeper into a world he had long since abandoned.
I ran the complaints desk for 30 years. You think you're just listening to people moan about their gas bill, but you're not. You're listening to their lives. The bill is just the doorway they use to let you in.
Fabian felt a jolt of recognition. He, too, used a benign subject as a doorway, but his purpose was to enter and destroy. Harold's purpose had been to enter and, if not fix, then at least to listen. The parallel was unnerving, a distorted reflection of his own methods.
I had this one rule: never confuse being nice with being kind. They're different animals entirely.
Fabian leaned against the wall. The cool plaster, a stark contrast to the warmth of Harold's words.
Niceness is what you do to make things smooth. It's about avoiding a fuss. You say, I understand your frustration. Even when you don't, it's a lubricant. It doesn't cost you anything.
Fabian's entire professional persona was built on niceness. His scripts were masterpieces of soothing, frictionless politeness. He was the king of, I understand your frustration.
But kindness is different. Kindness is costly. It's when you stay on the line with the woman whose power is out, not because it's your job, but because she's scared of the dark and needs to hear a voice. Kindness is telling someone a hard truth they need to hear, even if they'll hate you for it. It's about taking on a little bit of their burden. It has weight.
The words struck Fabian with the force of a physical impact. Cost, weight, burden. These were the very things his entire system was designed to avoid. His politeness was a shield, just as Harold had said. It was self-preservation masquerading as courtesy.
Most apologies don't fix a thing. They're just a way of asking to be forgiven for the mess. But a real apology, a kind one, that's about acknowledging the harm you've done without any expectation of being let off the hook. It's about showing you understand the cost.
Fabian thought of the files on his laptop, all marked resolved. He had never considered the cost. Not really. He had offered a warning, a polite fiction of choice, and absolved himself. He saw now, with sickening clarity, that his informed consent was nothing more than the ultimate act of niceness. A soothing lie, he told himself.
Oh, listen to me rambling on. You're a busy man, I'm sure. I'm keeping you.
Fabian found himself rushing to reassure him. No, not at all, Mr. Levin, he said, and for the first time the polite phrase felt entirely true. It's been informative. It was the best word he could find, a clinical term for an experience that felt anything but. He had called for data and instead received a lesson in moral philosophy from a lonely old man.
Well, that's good to hear. You have a good way about you, Mark. You listen. Not many people do that anymore. They just wait for their turn to talk.
The compliment felt deeply unearned. Fabian was a professional listener, but his listening was a weapon. He listened for vulnerabilities, for openings, for the precise moment to strike. Harold listened to connect, to understand, to share a small piece of the human burden. Fabian felt a pang of something he could only identify as shame. He was an imposter, using the tools of connection for the purpose of absolute disconnection. As Fabian prepared to end the call, to retreat back into the safety of his silent, ordered world, Harold spoke again. He deployed the same simple, devastating weapon he had used the night before. It came without fanfare, a casual closing remark born of decades of habit, of genuine interest in the person on the other end of the line.
You take care of yourself now, Mark, and tell me how are holding up.
The question was a soft tap on a hairline fracture, and this time the crack widened. Fabian froze. The question was not a rhetorical pleasantry. In Harold's mouth, it was a genuine invitation. It asked for a real answer. It assumed there was a person on the other end of the line. Person who was holding up against some unseen pressure. For the second time in 2 days, Fabian was rendered speechless. Who was he? He was a collection of scripts, a series of lies, a hollow man. To answer the question honestly would be to confess a life so dark and empty it would horrify this kind old man. To lie would be to disrespect the very authenticity Harold had so freely offered him. He managed a non-committal murmur, a vague pleasantry that was neither a truth nor a lie, and quickly ended the call. He tossed the burner phone onto the couch as if it were hot to the touch. The silence that rushed back in was no longer just quiet. It was a vacuum. It was a space where his answer should have been. The question reverberated in his mind. It was a simple, everyday query, but in the context of his life, it was an existential threat. It demanded an identity, a self, and Fabian had systematically dismantled his own. He was a function, a tool. Tools do not have feelings. They do not hold up. They simply perform or they fail. He walked to the window and stared down at the city below. The cars moved like blood cells through glowing arteries, each one filled with a person who had a life, a name, a set of relationships. People who could answer Harold's question. They were holding up, or they were falling apart. They were celebrating, or they were grieving. They were something. What was he? He was the ghost watching them, the predator who used the language of shepherds. Harold's voice, his stories, his simple, kind questions, they had acted as a developer fluid, revealing the invisible ink of Fabian's own emptiness. The anesthesia of procedure was wearing off. The corporate jargon of resolutions and service levels now sounded like a grotesque parody. He had built a fortress of politeness to protect himself from the moral horror of his work. But Harold, with a few rambling anecdotes and a simple question, had walked right through the gate. He had shown Fabian that his shield was made of glass. It could reflect a perfect image of a calm, collected professional. But it was fragile and it was beginning to shatter. The work had always been ugly, but he had managed to keep it separate, contained. Now, the ugliness felt personal. The silence in his apartment was no longer a refuge, it was a judgment. It was filled with the echo of Harold's voice, a constant, gentle reminder of a humanity he had tried to forget. The hold music that once calmed him now sounded like a funeral dirge. The next name on his list, the next job, the next courtesy call. The thought of it filled him not with the usual cold focus, but with a profound sense of dread. The script had been his armor for so long. Now, it felt like a cage. And for the first time, Fabian Beard wanted out. A few days passed, a quiet stretch that Marta's dashboard would have flagged as low productivity. For Fabian, it was a period of unnerving stillness. The routines that had once anchored him now felt like hollow motions. He cleaned his equipment with the same precision, but his hands felt disconnected from the task. He reviewed market data for Marta, but the numbers swam before his eyes, meaningless. The echo of Harold's voice, and more profoundly his questions, had become a permanent resident in the quiet spaces of Fabian's mind. The anesthesia was well and truly gone, and he was left with the raw, throbbing nerve of his own conscience, a part of himself he had long presumed amputated. The inevitable call from Marta finally came. Her voice was as crisp and devoid of warmth as ever, a clean digital signal cutting through his analog turmoil.
Fabian, we have a new file for you. Standard retrieval and resolution. The client is eager for a swift turnaround.
Her tone was that of a manager assigning a routine task, but Fabian heard an undercurrent of impatience. His recent inactivity had not gone unnoticed. He accepted the assignment with his usual professional brevity, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. The script was already fraying at the edges, the persona of the efficient contractor becoming harder to inhabit. He felt a cold dread creep into his stomach, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his very first job. He opened the encrypted file. The target was a man named Julian Croft, a financial analyst who had uncovered a shell corporation and threatened to expose it. The details were all there. Croft's daily routine, his favourite coffee shop, the gym he visited 3 times a week. The file also included the access points to his apartment building and the blind spots in its security camera coverage. It was a standard package, meticulously prepared, offering a clear path to resolution. In the past, Fabian would have seen it as a puzzle, a logistical challenge to be solved with elegant efficiency. Now, he saw the face of a man whose life was about to be reduced to a closed ticket. The most difficult part was no longer the act itself, but the prelude, the courtesy call. The ritual that had once been his shield now felt like a cruel mockery. He was supposed to dial a number, adopt a pleasant tone, and offer a flimsy, disingenuous warning to a man he was about to execute. The thought of performing that lie, of speaking the soothing, empty words, filled him with a profound sense of self-loathing. He was trapped. To refuse the job was to invite scrutiny and suspicion from Marta, an outcome with its own lethal consequences. To proceed was to betray the fragile, nascent humanity that Harold's calls had awakened in him. He was caught between 2 irreconcilable worlds. Fabian sat in his rental car, parked 2 blocks from Julian Croft's upscale apartment building. The evening was cool, and the city lights painted soft focus blurs on his windshield. The headset felt heavier than usual, a leaden weight on his head. He had procrastinated for an hour, scrolling through the file, rereading details he had already memorized. He was stalling, a behavior so alien to his professional identity that it felt like a symptom of a sickness. The hold music he'd selected, a bland piano loop, did nothing to soothe him. Instead, its repetitive, cheerful melody felt like a taunt, a stark contrast to the grim reality of his purpose. He took a breath, forcing himself into the role. He was David, from the building's concierge service. The script he'd written felt flimsy, pathetic. A warning about a scheduled maintenance check on the fire suppression system that would require unit-by-unit access. The planted detail was a mention of the faulty latch on the service elevator, a fact Croft would know from a recent building-wide email. The suggested escape was a recommendation to be out of the building between 10 and 11 p.m. to avoid the inconvenience. It was the same old formula, the same holocausy. But this time, the words tasted like ash. He dialed the number. As the phone rang, Harold's voice echoed in his memory. Kindness is costly. It's telling someone a hard truth they need to hear, even if they'll hate you for it. The thought was an electric jolt. What was this polite fiction if not the cheapest form of interaction? It was designed to cost him nothing, to absolve him of responsibility. It was niceness, not kindness. Croft answered, his voice sharp and preoccupied. Fabian launched into the script, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. The smooth, practiced empathy sounded forced, the soft chuckles hollow. He felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines, or worse, no longer believed in the play. As he spoke, a new, dangerous impulse took hold. He could do more. He could go beyond the script. Instead of a vague warning, he could give a real one. He could break the cardinal rule of his profession and make it explicit. Mr. Croft, he said, his voice dropping, losing the cheerful lilt of David. I need you to listen to me very carefully. The information I'm giving you is not a suggestion. Your presence in the building tonight is a direct threat to your safety. I am advising you in the strongest possible terms to leave your apartment immediately and not return. The words hung in the air, a flagrant breach of protocol. He had torn up the script and stepped onto a bridge. Julian Croft's reaction was not what Fabian expected. The shift in tone, the raw urgency, had cut through the man's initial annoyance. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a moment of charged silence.
Who is this?
Croft asked, his voice low and suspicious, but the dismissive arrogance was gone. He was listening. For a dizzying moment, Fabian felt a surge of hope. This was it. This was what it meant to be kind, not just nice. This was the cost. Revealing his hand, taking a real risk. He was no longer a detached observer. He was an active participant in this man's chance for survival. My name doesn't matter, Fabian replied, his mind racing to control the spiraling situation. What matters is that you have made powerful enemies. They know your routine, they know where you live, and they have sent someone to resolve the problem you represent. That person is me. The confession was electrifying, a violation of every principle he had ever held. He was exposing the operation, exposing himself. He could feel Marta's digital eyes on him, the metrics on her dashboard flashing red. But he pushed on, driven by the memory of Harold's gentle wisdom. He was trying to stop the harm from spreading, even if it meant setting himself on fire. He gave Croft specific, actionable instructions. Go to the basement garage. Do not use the main elevator, take the service stairs. There's a blue sedan, license plate G45V88. The keys are under the driver's side floor mat, the car is clean. Drive south. Don't stop until you cross the state line. Don't call anyone you know. Don't use your credit cards. Disappear. He was essentially handing the man an escape kit, a pre-packaged new life. It was an insane gamble. He was burning his own operational resources to save a target. Croft, now audibly shaken, began to ask questions, but Fabian cut him off. There is no time. Go. Now. He ended the call, his heart pounding in his chest. A mix of terror and exhilaration washed over him. He had shattered his own rules. He had taken on the burden, paid a small cost. For the first time, his warning wasn't a self-serving absolution. It was a genuine attempt to save a life. He started the car and pulled away from the curb, his part in the drama seemingly over. He would report to Marta that the target was not at home, that the window of opportunity had closed. It was a lie, but it was a lie in the service of a life, a reversal of his entire career. He felt a flicker of something that might have been pride. Fabian drove for 20 minutes, circling the city aimlessly, letting the adrenaline subside. He needed to put distance between himself and the scene, to let the story he would tell Marta solidify in his mind. He imagined Julian Croft in the blue sedan, racing down the highway toward a new uncertain future. The image was a comforting one. It felt like a balancing of the scales, a small deposit on the positive side of his moral ledger. He had finally used his skills for something other than destruction. He had listened to the voice of the old man on the phone and chosen a different path, a costlier one. He allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The feeling was short-lived. His encrypted phone buzzed with an incoming message from Marta. It wasn't a call. It was a single cold line of text.
Asset has been neutralized. Return to base for debrief.
Fabian's blood ran cold. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel. It was impossible. Croft was gone. He was on his way out of the state. He had followed the instructions. Fabian had saved him. He read the message again, and then a third time, but the words remained the same. Neutralized, resolved, closed. He pieced it together with a sickening, dawning horror. Croft must have hesitated. Perhaps he had called his wife. Perhaps he had stopped to grab a laptop with the evidence he'd collected. Maybe he simply didn't believe the warning until it was too late. People were creatures of habit and attachment, even in the face of death. Fabian's detailed escape plan had been no match for the simple, powerful pull of a life left behind. And Marta, ever efficient, must have had a contingency, a second operative, a tracker, a plan B. His deviation from the script had not saved Croft. It had only made his death more complicated. The hope he had felt just moments before curdled into a bitter, profound despair. His grand gesture of kindness had been utterly futile. The man was dead anyway. All Fabian had accomplished was exposing himself, breaking protocol, and lighting up every single one of Marta's warning indicators. His courtesy was, in the end, nothing more than self-absolution after all, whether he offered a polite fiction or a detailed escape plan. The result was the same. The system was bigger than his choices. His attempt to be kind had cost him dearly. But it had bought Julian Croft nothing at all. The weight of the failure was immense, a crushing testament to his own impotence. The debrief with Marta was as sterile and chilling as Fabian had anticipated. It took place not in person, but over a secure video link, her face a cool, impassive mask on his laptop screen. She didn't yell, she didn't make threats. Her approach was far more unnerving. She simply presented the data. She showed him the recording of his call with Croft, the audio waveform a visible testament to his betrayal. She displayed the logs showing the unsanctioned use of the escape vehicle. She pointed to the metrics that tracked his deviation from the established operational parameters. It was honestly an autopsy of his failure, conducted with the detached precision of a surgeon.
Your performance on the Croft file was suboptimal, Fabian. You deviated from the approved script, you exposed methods, you compromised a valuable asset. Your role is to provide a specific, limited service. You are a scalpel, not a triage nurse. You are not authorized to make judgments about the patient's right to live.
Each word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall of condemnation around him. He had no defense. The data was absolute. He had failed not because the target died, but because he had tried to prevent it. In Marta's world, that was the greater sin.
You have been a reliable contractor for a long time. Your resolution stats are exemplary. For that reason, we are treating this as a performance issue, not a loyalty issue. For now.
The unspoken threat hung in the digital air between them.
You will be assigned a new file immediately, a high-priority contract. I expect you to adhere to the established protocol without deviation. Consider it a test of your commitment to our brand promise.
It was not a request. It was an order. A chance to prove he could once again become the unthinking, efficient tool he was meant to be. Fabian simply nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He knew he had no choice. Refusal was not an option. He had to get back in line, follow the script, and execute the next job with flawless, cold precision. Anything less would sign his own death warrant. Marta ended the call, and a moment later, a new file appeared on his desktop. The encryption dissolved, revealing the name and face of his next target. He clicked it open, his heart a leaden weight in his chest, preparing himself for the next soul he was tasked with resolving. He was a scalpel again. He had to be. The file loaded. A photograph appeared on the screen, a candid shot of a man in his 40s, with a tired but determined look in his eyes. He had a stubborn set to his jaw and a familiar weariness around his eyes that Fabian recognized instantly, though he had never seen the man before. He read the name printed below the photograph, Eli Levin. The name struck him with the force of a physical blow. Levin. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He scrolled down, his hand trembling, to the section detailing the target's personal information and known associates. There it was, listed under next of kin. Harold Levin, father. A wave of nausea washed over him. It wasn't possible. It was a coincidence of such staggering improbability that it felt like a deliberate act of fate, a trap designed specifically for him. The man on his screen was the son Harold had spoken of, the estranged child he hadn't seen in years, the son whose absence was a source of quiet, constant pain for the old man who had inadvertently become Fabian's confessor. The universe had taken the two threads of his life, the dark, violent path of his profession, and the fragile human connection he had stumbled into and woven them into a noose. He read the file again, desperately searching for an error, a mistake, some detail that would prove this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But there was no mistake. Eli Levin was an insurance fraud investigator. He had been digging into a complex network of clinics and shell companies, the same network Julian Croft had stumbled upon. Eli, it seemed, had gotten too close. He had become a liability, a problem that needed to be resolved permanently. And Marta, in a move of either supreme ignorance or calculated cruelty, had assigned the resolution to Fabian. The irony was suffocating. Harold had spoken of his son with a mixture of regret and love, lamenting the pride and pain that kept them apart. He had no idea that his son was in mortal danger, and he certainly had no idea that the polite man on the phone, the one he had shared his stories with, was the very instrument of that danger. Fabian felt trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The failure with Croft was a simple miscalculation compared to this. This was a moral checkmate. To kill Eli would be to destroy the last link to the only genuine human connection Fabian had felt in years. It would be a betrayal, not just of his own nascent conscience, but of the kind old man who had asked him how he was doing. Fabian sat in the dark for a long time, the face of Eli Levin glowing on the screen. The path forward was shrouded in fog. He could not kill this man. The thought was absolute, a new bedrock in his shifting moral landscape. But he could not refuse the assignment without bringing the full weight of Marta's organization down on himself, and likely on the Levins as well. His failed attempt to save Croft had proven that a simple warning was not enough. The system had redundancies, it had contingencies. To truly save Eli, he would need to do more than just go off script. He would need to rewrite the entire play. An idea began to form, a desperate high-wire act of a plan. He could not save Eli alone. The man was stubborn, proud. Harold's stories had made that clear. He wouldn't trust a strange voice on the phone any more than Croft had, but maybe, just maybe, he would listen to his father. The rift between them was a vulnerability, but it could also be a bridge. If he could nudge them toward each other, if Harold could be the one to deliver the warning, it might just be enough to break through Eli's hardened skepticism. It was a long shot, a plan built on hope and psychological manipulation, but it was the only one he had. He picked up a fresh burner phone, his fingers tracing its smooth, anonymous surface. His next call would not be to the target. It would be to the target's father. He would call Harold. He wouldn't pose as a bank representative or a utility worker this time. He would be Tom again. Polite man from the misdialed call. The one who had listened. He would have to lie, of course, but it would be a different kind of lie. A lie designed to build, not to destroy. A lie in the service of a fragile, desperate hope for reconciliation and survival. It was a kindness that would be incredibly costly. He dialed the familiar number, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt a profound sense of dread, but also a sliver of purpose. He was no longer just a scalpel. He was something else now, something more complicated and far more dangerous. As the phone began to ring, he took a deep breath, preparing to use the only tools he had, his voice, his scripts, his mastery of polite deception, not to serve his contract, but to defy it.
Harold, you should call your son today. Just do it.
The first move in a game he could not afford to lose.
Hello? Tom? No, not a bad time at all. It's good to hear from you. I was just thinking about that conversation we had, about kindness. It's been rattling around in my head.
The phone rang 4 times before Harold picked up. His hello? Carrying its usual mix of gentle curiosity and faint surprise. Fabienne, now inhabiting the persona of Tom once more, felt a strange sense of coming home. This call was different from any he had ever made. His objective was not to warn a target or gather intelligence for a kill. It was to perform a delicate, high-stakes act of emotional surgery. He needed to nudge this lonely old man toward the son he hadn't spoken to in years. And he had to do it without revealing the monstrous truth of the situation. The script for this conversation hadn't been written. He would have to improvise it from the fragments of honesty Harold himself had given him. Hello, Harold. It's Tom. From the other day, Fabian began, his voice softer, less polished than his usual professional personas. He let a hint of his own tension seep into the tone, hoping it would register as sincerity. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. The opening was better than Fabian could have hoped for. Harold had already laid the tracks for the conversation Fabian needed to have. He was inviting him in, just as he always did. Fabian took the opening, carefully weaving his lie. It's been on my mind too, Harold, so much so that it made me do something a little unusual. I remembered you mentioning your son, Eli. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air, a calculated risk. He was crossing a boundary, moving from a polite stranger to someone referencing a deeply personal, painful subject. I felt like I should encourage you to reach out to him. Life is short, you know? Sometimes we let things go on for too long, and we forget why we were even upset in the first place. The words were platitudes, but he delivered them with the quiet conviction of a man confessing a hard-won truth.
It's not that simple, Tom. It's been years. A call out of the blue, it might do more harm than good. He's a busy man, important. I wouldn't want to be a burden.
The word burden landed like a stone in Fabian's gut. It was the exact fear he had predicted, the wall he knew he would have to dismantle. This was the first test of his new, inverted skill set to convince a man that his love was not a burden, but a lifeline. Fabian now found himself managing 2 separate, clandestine relationships, a juggler trying to keep 2 fragile glass balls in the air. His life, once a model of compartmentalized efficiency, became a chaotic dance between 2 phones, 2 personas, 2 desperate objectives. The first line was to Harold, a series of gentle, patient calls where he played the role of a concerned friend. He would listen to Harold's fears about reconnecting with Eli, offering quiet encouragement and reframing the act, not as intrusion, but as a gift. He's your son, Harold, Fabian would say. Hearing your voice is not a burden, it's a reminder of where he comes from. It's an anchor. The second line was to Eli. This was a far more dangerous and delicate operation, posing as a low-level corporate whistleblower from a rival insurance firm. Fabian, now Alex, made contact. He had to give Eli just enough verifiable information to be credible, but not so much that it would lead back to him or Marta's organization. He spoke in clipped, paranoid tones, using burner phones that he would discard after a single use.
You're getting too close, Levin. The network you're investigating, it's not just about fraudulent claims. These people don't just write angry letters. You need to back off. Take a vacation, now.
The 2 conversations were a study in contrasts. With Harold, Fabian's voice was warm, his pacing slow and reassuring. He was a cultivator, tending to the fragile shoots of an old man's hope. With Eli, his voice was sharp, urgent, and laced with fear. He was a warning siren, attempting to scare a stubborn man into a state of self-preservation. He would end a call with Harold, filled with the warmth of their connection, and immediately have to switch gears, plunging into the cold, paranoid world of his calls with Eli. The mental whiplash was exhausting, a constant draining toggling between kindness and alarm. This double life was a logistical nightmare. He had to keep his stories straight, his personas distinct, and his tracks covered. He spoofed his call locations, routed them through multiple servers, and used voice modulation software for the calls to Eli. Every conversation was a performance on a high wire, with the slightest misstep threatening to send the entire enterprise crashing down. He was using the tools of deception, not for a clean, single resolution, but for a messy, complicated, and uncertain salvation. He was breaking every rule he had ever lived by, all in service of a coincidence that had become his sole purpose. Harold resisted. His hesitation was not born of anger or pride, but of a deep, ingrained fear that Fabian found heartbreakingly familiar. It was the fear of being a burden, of reopening old wounds only to find them deeper than he remembered.
What if he hangs up on me, Tom? After all this time, I don't know if I could bear that. Sarah, my wife, she was always the bridge between us. After she passed, well, the bridge washed out. I don't know how to build a new one.
He spoke of Eli's childhood, of a bright, determined boy who grew into a man who saw the world in black and white, right and wrong. Fabian listened, his role shifting from a simple encourager to something more akin to a grief counselor. He drew on the stories Harold himself had told him. You ran a complaints desk for 30 years, Harold. You know how to listen. You know how to talk to people who are upset. This is just another call. The most important one, maybe. He tried to arm the old man with his own wisdom, turning Harold's life lessons back on him as a form of encouragement. He was coaching him, providing him with scripts, not of deception, but of raw, painful honesty. Just tell him you miss him, Fabian urged. Doesn't have to be more complicated than that.
There was a fight about an insurance claim after Sarah got sick. He thought I was being taken advantage of, that I was too soft. He wanted to fight them, to sue. I just wanted peace. I just wanted to focus on her. He said I was letting them win. He said I had no spine.
The memory was clearly a source of immense pain, the core of the estrangement. Eli's protective instinct had clashed with Harold's desire for quiet dignity, and the chasm had opened between them. Pride on one side, exhaustion on the other. Fabian saw the whole tragic picture. Eli, the fraud investigator, had seen his father as a potential victim of a scam, and had tried to intervene with his characteristic bullheadedness. Harold, overwhelmed with his wife's illness, had seen his son's intervention as an accusation of weakness. He was trying to protect you, Harold, Fabian said softly, realizing the truth of it as he spoke. It came out wrong, but his heart was in the right place. Maybe he just needs to know that you see that now. He was no longer just trying to get Harold to make a call. He was trying to mend the very fabric of their relationship, a task for which he was profoundly, terrifyingly unqualified.
I feel nauseous, believe me. Never had a lot of shit come easy. Had to work hard.
Eli Levin was just as difficult, but for entirely different reasons. He was a man who trusted no one, least of all an anonymous voice on a burner phone. His entire career was built on sniffing out lies and deceptions, and Fabian's Alex persona set off every alarm bell in his professional arsenal.
Who is this? How did you get this number? If you have information, give it to me straight. I don't have time for these spy games.
He was all pride and professional skepticism, a bulldog who refused to be warned off a scent. Fabian fed him scraps of truth, small morsels of insider information about the fraud network to prove his bona fides. He mentioned a specific offshore account number, the name of a shell corporation that wasn't yet public knowledge. Each new detail was a risk, a piece of the puzzle that could potentially be traced back to him. This isn't about a lawsuit, Levin, Fabian hissed during one tense call. This is about survival. The people you're chasing, their solution to a problem like you isn't a settlement. It's a shallow grave. I'm telling you, I've seen it happen. A colleague of mine, a man named Croft, he got too close too. The mention of Julian Croft's name, a name that had been in the news as a tragic but accidental death, finally seemed to land. Eli went quiet for a moment. Fabian had struck a nerve.
What about Croft? The papers said it was a car accident.
The papers say what they're told to say, Fabian retorted, letting the chilling implications sink in. He was playing a dangerous game, using the ghost of a man he had failed to save as a tool to save another. The guilt was a physical weight, but he pushed it down. There was no room for guilt now, only for the cold calculus of manipulation. Despite the growing evidence, Eli's pride and stubbornness were formidable obstacles. He saw backing down as a form of cowardice. His whole life was about confronting bullies and cheats, and he refused to be intimidated.
So I should just run? Let them win? That's not how I operate.
Fabian heard the echo of Harold's story in his son's words. It was the same righteous, unbending certainty that had caused the rift between them years ago. He was trying to save a man who was fundamentally unwilling to be saved, a man who would rather be right than be alive. The parallel lines of his two operations were not just running side by side, they were destined to collide. The strain of his double life began to wear on Fabian. He barely slept. His Spartan apartment, once a sanctuary of order, became a cluttered command center littered with burner phones, scribbled notes, and empty coffee cups. The lines between his personas started to blur. He would find himself using a gentle, patient tone with Eli, or a sharp, clipped phrase with Harold, and have to catch himself. The constant performance was hollowing him out, but it was also teaching him something. He was learning to listen, in a way he never had before, not for weaknesses to exploit, but for the emotional truths hidden beneath the words. In the quiet, sleepless hours between his calls, fragments of his own past began to surface, unbidden. He remembered his childhood, his mother who worked from home, a telemarketer selling vacation packages. He remembered her headset, a permanent fixture, and the sweet melodic voice she used with strangers on the phone. He remembered the contrast between that voice and the weary, defeated silence she wore when the headset came off. He remembered her absorbing the anger and frustration of strangers all day, her mantra, a constant placating. I completely understand. She was a professional soother, neutralizing hostility with an endless supply of verbal niceness. Fabian realized, with a jolt that felt like a rewiring of his own brain, that he had built his entire professional life on a twisted version of his mother's coping mechanism. She had used her voice to deflect verbal abuse and make a living. He had weaponized it to enable violence and death. She had absorbed the world's ugliness with a smile that never reached her eyes. He had packaged it into a neat, procedural service. Both of them had used politeness as a shield, a way to survive a reality that was just too harsh to face head-on. The headset was not just a tool, it was an inheritance. This new self-awareness was not comforting. It was devastating. It stripped away the last vestiges of the fiction he had built for himself, the idea that he was a cool, detached professional, a master of his own destiny. He was not a master, he was a product. He was the dark evolution of his mother's practiced sweetness, a man who had learned early that the right tone of voice could create a safe distance from harm. But his mother's shield had only protected her feelings. His had allowed him to extinguish lives. The realization didn't absolve him. It deepened his culpability, making his current desperate attempt at redemption feel all the more urgent.
All right, Tom, all right, I'll do it. I'll call him.
Fabian felt a surge of relief, so profound it almost brought him to his knees. It was the first real glimmer of hope. He coached Harold one last time, reminding him to keep it simple, to speak from the heart. Meanwhile, he placed another call to Eli, a final, desperate warning.
They're moving on you, Levin. Tonight. Whatever you think you know, you're wrong. Get out of your apartment. Don't be a hero.
Fabian monitored the situation from a distance. Parked in his car several blocks away, a police scanner murmuring quietly on the seat beside him. He had given Eli a specific piece of advice. Meet the anonymous contact who had been feeding him information at a public cafe, a place too crowded for a clean hit. He had then fed this false information into a low-level channel he knew Marta's team monitored, hoping to draw the hitman to the wrong location. It was a classic misdirection shell game where he prayed Eli would follow his instructions and not be under the wrong shell. He listened to the city's hum, his entire plan hinging on the choices of two stubborn men. At first, it seemed to work. Eli, rattled by the specificity of Fabian's warning, and perhaps softened by a call from his father, actually left his apartment. Fabian tracked his phone's signal as it moved toward the designated safe location. But then, halfway there, the signal stopped. It lingered in one spot for several minutes, then abruptly changed direction. Heading back toward his apartment building, he reverted to habit. He must have forgotten a piece of evidence, a crucial file, or simply decided he wouldn't be chased out of his own home. Pride, that stubborn Levin trait, had overridden the instinct for survival. The police scanner crackled to life, a call reporting gunshots in Eli's neighborhood. Fabian's heart plummeted. He had failed. Again. He drove toward the scene, his mind a maelstrom of panic and self-recrimination. He arrived to see the flashing lights of police cars and an ambulance. Paramedics were loading a man onto a gurney. It was Eli. He was alive, clutching his arm, his face pale with shock, but etched with fury. It had been a near miss, a botched attempt. The hitman, likely spooked by the unexpected resistance or the quick police response, had fled after only wounding him. Eli was alive, but his paranoia would now be absolute, and Marta would know her primary contractor had interfered. The fallout was immediate and, honestly, severe. Before Fabian had even made it back to his apartment, his access to the company's network was frozen. His encrypted communication channels just went dead. The flow of information that was the lifeblood of his work, well, it was cut off completely. He was, for the first time, truly blind. Marta didn't need to call him for a debrief this time. The data kind of spoke for itself. The target was still alive. The hitman sent as backup had been forced to retreat. And Fabian's digital footprints, however carefully he had tried to hide them, would be all over the misdirection play. He hadn't just deviated from the script, he had actively sabotaged the performance. So, there he sat, in his dark apartment, the silence now a definitive suffocating threat. He was no longer a contractor on probation. He was a liability. A leak. In Marta's clinical worldview, leaks weren't to be patched. They were to be sealed. He knew what was coming. The system he had served so faithfully for years was now turning its cold, efficient gaze upon him. He was no longer the scalpel. He was the cancerous tissue to be excised. The thought was terrifying, but also, in a strange way, liberating. The pretense was over. The double life had collapsed. There was only one line now. Survival. He imagined Marta, in her own sterile office, staring at a dashboard that was no longer just showing anomalies, but a full-scale system failure. The metrics for the Eli Levin file would be a sea of red. Call durations off the charts, unauthorized asset movements, failed resolution, an active, ongoing threat. Her brand promise had been broken. Her predictable, orderly world had been thrown into chaos by a single employee's crisis of conscience. She would not see it in those terms, of course. She would see it as a critical error, a bug in the system that needed to be debugged in the most permanent way possible. Fabian began to work, his movements now fueled by pure adrenaline. He was no longer trying to save Eli from a distance. He was preparing for direct confrontation. He packed a go bag, not with the tools of an assassin, but with the tools of an escape artist. Cash, false IDs, more burner phones, a police scanner, and a small concealable firearm. His objective had simplified. He was no longer juggling the delicate emotions of a father-son reunion. He was a man marked for death, and his only path to survival was to protect the very people who had, maybe without meaning to, placed him in the crosshairs. His encrypted phone, the one reserved for direct, high-priority communications from Marta, buzzed to life. It was the only line she had left open for him. The single buzz was a summons, a command. He answered, his hand steady.
Fabian, you have created a significant operational vulnerability. The Eli Levin file remains open, and you have introduced a new unacceptable variable.
What do you want, Marta? Fabian asked, his own voice low and steady. He would not play the part of the frightened subordinate. He would not give her the satisfaction. The scripts were gone. There was only the raw truth of their situation.
I want you to close the loop. The source of the leak has been identified. It's not the son, it's the father. The old man you've been speaking to. Your unsanctioned communications have made him a liability. He is the point of origin for this entire deviation.
Fabian felt the floor drop out from under him. He had been so focused on Eli, so wrapped up in the drama of the hit, that he had overlooked the most obvious, cruelest move on the board. He had thought he was the target, but Marta was more pragmatic than that. Why eliminate a skilled, albeit rogue contractor when you could force him to correct his own mistake. She was ordering him to kill Harold, to erase the very person who had prompted his rebellion. It was a test of loyalty, a punishment, and a cleanup operation all rolled into one brutally efficient command.
Close the leak, Fabian. Eliminate Harold Levin. Once the source is contained, we will re-evaluate your position. Consider it your final opportunity to demonstrate your value.
The line went dead. Fabian stood in the echoing silence of his apartment, the phone still pressed to his ear. He looked at the go bag on his bed, the tools of escape. He thought of the hold music that once timed his kills, its bland loops, a symbol of his detachment. The loop had now closed in on itself, leading him right back to the beginning, to the gentle, unsuspecting old man who had simply asked, "And how are you, dear?" Fabian drove through the rain-slicked streets, the city lights blurring into long, weeping streaks on the windshield. His destination was not a rental car drop-off or an anonymous hotel, but Harold Levin's quiet, unassuming apartment building. Marta's order echoed in the car's interior, a command as cold and absolute as a locked door. Close the leak. Eliminate Harold Levin. It was the final twisted loop of the hold music that had governed his life, a melody that had started as a tool for detachment and had ended as the soundtrack to his own damnation. He was being sent to destroy the one person who had seen him as human. He parked across the street, the engine idling with a low, mournful hum. He could see the warm, yellow light in Harold's window, a small beacon of humanity against the dark, indifferent facade of the building. He imagined the old man inside, maybe making a cup of tea, surrounded by his memories and his stacks of books, completely unaware of the predator circling outside. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp twisting in his gut. For years he had operated under the fiction that his targets were just files, case numbers to be resolved. Harold had shattered that fiction. He was not a file. He was the man who had asked, "And how are you, dear?" Fabian picked up his encrypted phone, the one Marta had left open for him. His hand was perfectly steady, a testament to years of training, but his heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He had to make one last call. It was not a courtesy call in the old sense, not a disingenuous warning meant to absolve him. This was something else entirely. It was a confession, a farewell, a final desperate grasp at the connection that had upended his world. He dialed the familiar number, the sequence of digits now burned into his memory. He didn't know what he would say. The scripts were all gone, burned away in the fire of the last few days.
Hello?
"Harold," Fabian said, his own voice raspy, unfamiliar. "It's me." He didn't say Tom. He didn't say Mark. He just said me. The only truth he had left to offer. There was a pause on the other end, and Fabian could sense the old man's mind working, connecting the voice to the polite strangers from the bank and the utility company. But Harold didn't question it. Instead, he seemed to sense the storm behind the simple words.
Son, you sound terrible. Is everything all right?
Harold's simple, heartfelt concern was the final blow to Fabian's crumbling composure. He just couldn't bring himself to explain the monstrous reality of the situation. The fact that he was parked outside with orders to kill him. Instead, he let the silence stretch. A roar. open wound on the phone line. Harold, with the practiced empathy of a man who had spent a lifetime listening to unspoken troubles, did not push. He simply waited.
There's a rule we had at the complaints desk. Sometimes you get a call and the problem is too big. A whole neighborhood is blacked out, a gas main is broken, you can't fix it. Not you, not personally.
Fabian closed his eyes, listening. The old man's words were, as always, a parable perfectly tailored to his crisis.
You can't fix the whole problem, but you can do one thing. You can stop the harm from spreading. You can keep the next person from calling in, panicked. You can tell one family to turn off their stove. You find the one small thing you can do, and you do it. You contain the damage.
The advice was a key, turning a lock in Fabian's mind. He couldn't dismantle the entire organization. He couldn't erase his past. But he could stop the harm from spreading to this one old man and his son. He could contain the damage. The choice crystallized, sharp and clear. He ended the call with a quiet "Thank you, Harold," and immediately went to work. His skill set, once used for predation, was now flipped inside out, repurposed for protection. He was a ghost in Marta's machine, and he knew all its secret passages. He opened his laptop and began to weave a web of elegant, polite deception. He spoofed Marta's own dashboards, feeding her false KPIs that showed him en route to Harold's apartment. He faked calendar invites for emergency maintenance in Eli's building, sending them to the local precinct to ensure a police presence. He was no longer a scalpel. He was a virus, flooding the system with corrupted data. He sent the new kill team, the brutal contractor Marta had assigned to clean up his mess, on a wild goose chase. He used the tools of his trade, a fake satisfaction survey call, a misdirected food delivery, a text message about a last-minute venue, change from a spoofed number to route them to a warehouse on the other side of town. Every lie was cloaked in the language of customer service, every misdirection a masterpiece of weaponized politeness. He was turning Marta's own sterile corporate methods against her. He was stopping the harm from spreading, one fake thank you for your patience at a time. With the kill team misdirected, Fabian had bought himself a small precious window of time. His next move was the most dangerous of all. He had to get both Harold and Eli out. He first drove to Eli's apartment, where the police presence he had engineered was just beginning to disperse. He approached Eli not as a phantom caller, but as a paramedic, a persona he adopted with practiced ease, telling him he was there for a follow-up check. Eli, still rattled and now deeply paranoid, was resistant. But Fabian's calm authority and knowledge of his wound brooked no argument.
You're not safe here. Your father isn't safe either. We're leaving now.
The drive to Harold's apartment was a blur of tension. Eli sat in the passenger seat, silent and suspicious, clutching his wounded arm. When they arrived, Fabian led him up the stairs, his heart pounding. He knocked on Harold's door. There was no time for a heartfelt reunion. Fabian hustled them into the apartment's small, cluttered kitchen, the safest room away from the windows. The awkward, halting apologies began to tumble out, colliding with the urgent reality of their situation.
I was just trying to protect you.
I know.
It was a clumsy, Imperfect reconciliation, happening in the shadow of a threat they still didn't fully understand. Fabian stood by the door, his senses on high alert. He was no longer using a headset to deliver words. He was using his entire body as a shield. He was the guardian at the gate, holding the door with his sheer force of will. He had stopped the harm from spreading, and in doing so, had brought these two broken pieces of a family back together. For a fleeting moment, in the quiet chaos of that kitchen, he felt a sense of rightness, a sense of purpose that had eluded him his entire life. The cost had been immense, but the fragile, beautiful thing he had built in this room felt, for the first time, worth it. The fragile peace was shattered by a soft knock on the apartment door. It wasn't the brutal contractor Fabian's misdirection had held. It was someone far more dangerous. He opened the door a crack and saw Marta standing in the hallway. She was alone, dressed in a sharp, dark suit. Her expression unreadable. She wasn't there for a resolution. She was there for a negotiation. She offered him a lifeline, a final exit ramp from the disaster he had created.
Finish the son, Fabian. The father is a non-entity. The leak is Eli. Finish the job and you walk away clean. We write off the rest as an acceptable loss.
It was the ultimate test. She was offering him a return to the old world, a way to erase his mistake and go back to being the efficient, detached tool he once was. He could have his life back, his anonymity, his safety. All it would cost was the life of the man in the other room, and the soul he had just begun to reclaim. He looked past Marta, down the empty hallway, and then back at her. The choice was no longer a choice. The man who had accepted that assignment no longer existed. Harold, his stories, his kindness, his simple piercing questions had killed that man. Fabian shook his head slowly. A quiet, sad smile touched his lips. You know, I've been giving people notice for years, Marta. Polite warnings, a head start, a courtesy. I thought it balanced the scales, but I was just giving notice to them. I was never listening to myself. I've been giving myself notice for weeks now. This is it. He stepped back and closed the door in her face. The soft click of the latch, a final resounding act of defiance. The standoff was over, the negotiation had failed. The moments that followed were a blur of controlled chaos. He knew Marta wouldn't simply walk away. He used the precious seconds he had to initiate his final gambit. It wasn't a violent act, but one of pure systemic sabotage. With a few keystrokes on a burner phone, he executed a program he had built, a digital bomb that didn't destroy data, but corrupted it, anonymized it, and buried it under layers of bureaucratic nonsense. He flooded their servers with millions of fake customer service requests, burying all active files, including his own and the Levins, in an avalanche of digital noise. He disabled the operation non-lethally, not with a gun, but with the very corporate jargon she prized. He burned his standing in the organization to the ground. In the aftermath, Fabian Baird ceased to exist. He burned his identities, erased his digital footprints, and vanished into the city's anonymous hum. But the man who emerged was not a ghost. He was someone new, defined not by resolutions, but by connections. He found a small quiet room in a part of the city where no one asked questions, and he set up a desk. On it, he placed a headset, the same kind he had always used, but now for a very different purpose. He built a new kind of service, a quiet, underground complaints line. It was a rumor, a whisper, a number passed on scraps of paper to those on the edges of organized violence. He used his old skills, his ability to read data, to see patterns, to anticipate the moves of men like his former colleagues. But now, instead of using that knowledge to execute a contract, he used it to warn the targets. He would call a journalist getting too close to a story, a witness about to testify, a small business owner refusing to pay protection money. His script was different now. It was honest. My name is not important, but I have reason to believe you are in danger. He was still giving notice, but it was no longer a self-serving courtesy. It was an act of costly, anonymous kindness. The hold music that once timed executions now marked the seconds of breathing room he bought for strangers. The reconciliation between Harold and Eli was imperfect, as all real things are. It was marked by long, awkward silences and the occasional flare-up of old frustrations, but it was real.
They talked on the phone. They met for coffee. Harold finally got to tell his son about the time a polite young man on the phone saved him from a gas leak, never knowing he was telling the story to the polite young man who had just saved his son.
They were building a new bridge, slowly, carefully, across the chasm that had separated them for so long. The harm had been contained. Fabian never saw them again. He remained a voice on the line, a ghost with a headset. His life was not one of peace. It was a constant, low-grade war, fought in whispers and encrypted signals, but it was a life of purpose. Harold had taught him the difference between politeness and kindness. Politeness soothes. It costs nothing. Kindness costs something. It has weight. It's staying on the line because someone is scared. It's telling a hard truth. It's stopping the harm from spreading. In his small, quiet room, surrounded by the static of 1,000 unheard complaints, Fabian Beard was finally paying. And in doing so, he was, at last, resolving himself.